At 63, Jim Carrey didn't fade from Hollywood. He vanished. One of the most explosive performers alive, a man whose face once defined an entire generation of comedy, suddenly disconnected from everything. No films, no interviews, no appearances. Just a silent, unexplained disappearance that left even his closest friends stunned. People assumed he was taking a break, but the truth was far darker. In the months before Jim stepped away, those closest to him noticed something terrifying. A shift so sharp, so sudden, that it made them fear that something inside him had finally snapped after decades of pushing, performing, and pretending everything was fine. Some insiders claim there was a night when Jim Carrey walked out of a studio, looked back at the building that made him a legend, and said he would never return. Not tomorrow, not ever, and he didn't. What could drive a man who had everything, fame, legacy, global love, to abandon it all without warning? What happened in those final public months that no one saw? And why is no one talking about the real reason he stepped into the shadows? The truth behind Jim Carrey's disappearance is not a simple story. It is shocking, twisted, and filled with secrets the world was never meant to hear. Before he walked away, something changed him forever. To the world, Jim Carrey was unstoppable. He wasn't just a star. He was an energy, a force of nature that Hollywood could barely contain. For years, people believed he lived in a constant state of joy, as if laughter poured from him without effort. When Jim walked into a room, everything shifted. Cameras swung his way. Reporters leaned forward. Fans screamed his name like he was a living miracle. He became the king of the impossible face. The man who could twist emotion into comedy, who could transform pain into punchlines. Hollywood marketed him as the eternal clown, fearless, loud, electric. He was sold as the guy who never breaks, never slows down, never hurts, a superhero made of rubber and confidence. Every poster showed him grinning. Every interview expected him to perform. Every studio banked on the idea that Jim Carrey was endless. And for a long time, the public believed it. They believed the laughter was real. They believed the energy was natural. They believed he was immune to the things that destroy ordinary people. He wasn't allowed to be sad. He wasn't allowed to be tired. He wasn't allowed to be human. In the public eye, Jim Carrey was a symbol, the one celebrity who could make the world forget its pain, even if he couldn't escape his own. But that image came with a price, because while the world loved Jim for his light, they never imagined how much darkness he carried behind it. The persona that made him a global icon slowly became a cage, one he didn't know how to break out of until much later in life. And as the spotlight grew brighter, the walls around him grew tighter. The world saw the smile, but it never saw the struggle. Behind the wild grin and the explosive energy, Jim Carrey carried a weight almost no one understood. People thought his comedy came from confidence, but the truth was far more complicated. Jim's brilliance came from a place few ever saw. A place shaped by childhood fear, instability, and a constant need to hold the world together, even when he felt like he was falling apart. Behind closed doors, the man who made millions laugh was often silent. Not sad, silent. The kind of silence that grows when a person spends too many years pretending. Jim lived in two separate worlds. The world on camera where he was invincible, and the world off camera where he questioned everything. Fame, purpose, identity, and even the meaning of happiness itself. People who knew him privately describe him in a way that almost contradicts the public image. Soft-spoken, deeply reflective, careful with his words. A man who analyzed life with a seriousness that could shock people who only knew his wild, comedic persona. He was the entertainer who could turn desperation into jokes. He was also the thinker who wondered why the world needed him to be someone he no longer recognized. As Jim's career grew, so did the distance between who he truly was and who he was expected to be. There were days when he could perform with unstoppable fire, giving everything, pouring out every ounce of energy until the entire room was vibrating with laughter. And then, hours later, he would sit alone in a quiet space, drained, staring at the floor, asking himself why he felt empty after giving the world so much joy. The hidden self was not weak. It was simply real. And reality rarely fits neatly into the expectations of Hollywood. Jim struggled with the pressure of always being on. Every interview demanded humor. Every talk show expected the wild face, the wild voice, the wild energy. He was never allowed stillness. If he ever tried to be quiet, people thought something was wrong. If he ever stopped smiling, they asked him to perform. If he ever showed depth, it confused them. The world had decided who he was and didn't want to hear otherwise. But inside, Jim Carrey was changing. He was becoming more aware of the spiritual, the emotional, and the psychological forces shaping his life. He read, studied, questioned, reflected. He asked himself why fame hadn't lifted the darkness he carried since childhood. He wondered why the laughter he created for others didn't soothe his own pain. He began to see fame not as a reward, but as a distraction. A loud, bright distraction that kept him from facing the truth he had avoided for decades. At times, Jim confessed to feeling like he wasn't real, like he was playing a character named Jim Carrey that the world expected him to embody. And the more he played that character, the less he felt connected to the person underneath. Loneliness found him in the strangest places. Hotel rooms after sold-out movies, private trailers after massive interviews, quiet mornings before scenes that would soon make the world roar with laughter. Moments where he looked in the mirror and wondered if anyone could see the man behind the smile. As he aged, this internal conflict only grew. He started withdrawing between projects, spending more time painting, reflecting, writing, and isolating himself from the frantic noise of fame. People thought he was becoming eccentric, but he was simply trying to find himself. There were hints, small interviews, odd quotes, moments where he spoke in almost philosophical riddles. Fans laughed, confused. But those close to him understood. Jim wasn't losing himself. He was searching. Searching for peace. Searching for meaning. Searching for a life that didn't demand a performance every waking minute. And the older he became, the harder it was to maintain the public mask. By his early 60s, the hidden self, the quiet, introspective, wounded part of him, was no longer staying hidden. It was rising. It was demanding space. It was demanding truth. And eventually, that hidden self would become the reason Jim Carrey stepped away from the spotlight altogether. The man the world thought they knew was never the full story. Jim Carrey's story didn't begin on a movie set, under bright lights, or in front of cheering crowds. It began in a small, struggling Canadian household where survival often mattered more than dreams. He was born into a family that fought every day just to stay afloat. Money was tight, bills piled up, and stability was something other families seemed to have, not the Carreys. From a young age, Jim felt the pressure that most adults couldn't handle. He wasn't just a child. He was a witness to the emotional and financial storms that shaped the lives around him. His father, Percy Carrey, was a man overflowing with talent, a gifted saxophone player, and a master of impressions who could have been a star himself under different circumstances. But life didn't give Percy the breaks he deserved. Instead, he worked regular jobs, often thanklessly, fighting to give his family a sense of normalcy even as everything threatened to fall apart. Jim adored him, and he feared becoming him, not because Percy wasn't brilliant, but because brilliance meant nothing without opportunity. When Jim was still young, the family's world collapsed. Percy lost his job, and the Carreys spiraled into poverty they could no longer hide. They lived out of a van for a time, cleaning buildings at night just to survive. Jim, a boy who should have been focused on school and play, suddenly found himself scrubbing floors at factories long after midnight. This wasn't the origin story of a comedian. It was the origin story of a fighter. Humor became Jim's armor. Impressions became his escape. Laughter became the only thing he could control. He studied people obsessively, teachers, neighbors, strangers on buses, copying their expressions, their voices, their quirks. Not because he wanted attention, but because it made people smile. And seeing others happy allowed him to forget even briefly how difficult life truly was. He became the class clown, not out of mischief, but out of survival. If he could make you laugh, you wouldn't see the fear he was hiding. If he kept everyone entertained, no one would ask why his family was struggling. Humor covered everything: hunger, insecurity, exhaustion, loneliness. His teachers didn't understand him. They saw disruption, not desperation. They saw a kid who couldn't sit still, not a kid trying to outrun reality. But behind every laugh, there was a silent promise Jim made to himself. He would escape this life. Not someday, not eventually. He would escape it now, whatever it took. By his teenage years, he had sharpened his talent to an almost frightening precision. He could mimic anyone. He could shape his face into impossible expressions. He could transform a room with a single gesture. And yet, despite this incredible gift, the world was still indifferent. His family still suffered. He still felt helpless to change anything. Then came the moment that would alter everything. Jim wrote himself a check, a real check, for $10 million, dating it years into the future. Not because he believed he would one day be rich, but because he needed something to believe in. When his mother fell sick and the weight on his father grew heavier than ever, Jim doubled down on his dream. He left school. He dove into stand-up comedy. He performed in smoky clubs, in tiny rooms, in places where most people never succeed. And yet something about him was undeniable. Darkness had shaped him. Pain had fueled him. Hope had carried him. This was where the real Jim Carrey was born, not the Hollywood star, but the determined, desperate young man who refused to let poverty define him. Long before he became the king of comedy, Jim Carrey was a boy standing in the shadows, promising himself that he would one day break free. The world had no idea what was coming. The spark that ignited Jim Carrey's rise didn't come from a studio or a casting director. It came from necessity, from hunger, from a burning desire to rewrite his life story before life rewrote it for him. As a teenager, Jim realized early that talent alone wouldn't save him. He needed timing, audacity, and a relentless refusal to accept no as an answer. He would perform anywhere, school stages, community centers, small comedy clubs, honing his craft in the shadows of a world that didn't yet know his name. It was in these small rooms, under dim lights, that Jim discovered the raw power of presence. He noticed how a single face contorted just so could make a room erupt. How a perfectly timed pause could build tension stronger than any punchline. He realized that comedy wasn't just jokes, it was truth. It was pain transformed into art. It was human emotion distilled into a performance so precise it could leave strangers gasping, laughing, or crying, sometimes all at once. One night, performing in a tiny Toronto club, a talent scout finally saw him. But the spark wasn't just recognition. It was the fire in Jim himself, an unshakable belief that he was meant for more than these small, smoke-filled rooms. He carried a strange energy, part desperation, part genius, part chaos. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to contain. Jim's first breakthrough wasn't with movies, it was with impressions and stand-up routines. He could mimic anyone, not just their voices, but their essence. And audiences were transfixed. This wasn't simple mimicry. It was truth filtered through obsession and imagination. Every movement, every word, every twitch of a muscle became a window into the human soul, exposing it with humor, empathy, and vulnerability. By his early 20s, Jim had begun to leave Toronto. He moved to Los Angeles, the city that could make or break him. And there, his spark began to meet opportunity. It was terrifying. The city was vast, crowded, and unforgiving. Every rejection stung harder than the last. But Jim's persistence was relentless. Failure didn't discourage him. It fueled him. On television, he made early appearances that startled audiences. There was something raw and dangerous about his style. He didn't just perform. He overwhelmed, captivated, and frightened viewers with a kind of manic energy that felt real. People laughed, but uneasily. It was as if they sensed the darkness behind the comedy. And they couldn't look away. The spark became a flame when Jim realized he could take this raw intensity and turn it into something the world had never seen before. A comedy that was both outrageous and deeply human. The kind of comedy that made people feel alive, unafraid to confront their own discomfort, their own pain, their own absurdity. It was dangerous. It was brilliant. It was Jim Carrey. And from this spark came the first hints of a man who could not be ignored. A performer whose laughter was addictive. A genius whose energy would define a generation. A star who had learned that the only way to survive was to set the world on fire with his talent, even if it consumed him in the process. The spark was more than talent. It was a declaration. Jim Carrey would not be invisible. He would not be ordinary. He would not allow the world to dictate the terms of his life. And from this fire, the road to superstardom had begun. Jim Carrey's breakthrough wasn't just a moment, it was a storm. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Hollywood was still learning how to handle him. Television recognized his talent first. In Living Color gave him a platform, a stage where his elastic face and explosive energy could mesmerize audiences. But even there, he wasn't fully understood. Producers saw him as chaotic, unpredictable, almost too extreme for the small screen. Yet the audience couldn't look away. Every sketch, every character, every exaggerated expression pulled viewers in. People laughed until they cried, not just at the jokes, but at the intensity, the manic brilliance, the raw, unstoppable force that was Jim Carrey. It wasn't just comedy, it was a revelation. He wasn't performing as much as he was exposing a truth about life, messy, absurd, chaotic, yet irresistible. And the world couldn't get enough. Hollywood began to take notice. Film offers came, slowly at first, then in a rush impossible to ignore. Movies like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and The Mask didn't just make Jim a star, they made him a phenomenon. He redefined what a comedy leading man could be: fearless, wild, uncontainable. With each role, he pushed the boundaries of possibility. He could be silly, grotesque, and absurd, but beneath the surface, there was always a flicker of vulnerability. Audiences laughed, yes, but they also connected, sensing something painfully real behind the performance. Critics were divided. Some dismissed him as too over the top, too extreme, almost unbearable. Others recognized genius, a rare, electrifying talent that fused comedy and tragedy in ways Hollywood had never seen. By the mid-1990s, Jim Carrey was unstoppable. Box office numbers soared. He had become a household name. The world didn't just know him, they needed him. Yet behind the breakthrough, the hidden self still lurked. Fame amplified both his genius and his internal struggle. The man who had conquered poverty and adversity now faced a new challenge: surviving success. The constant expectation to be brilliant, funny, and untouchable weighed heavily. Each new film became not just a project, but a test of endurance. Could he continue to be the unstoppable force audiences demanded? Could he continue to perform as though the world's happiness depended solely on his energy? And then came Dumb and Dumber, Liar Liar, and The Truman Show, roles that solidified him as both a comedic and dramatic talent. He had broken through Hollywood's walls. He had proven himself not just as a performer, but as a force that could dominate screens, hearts, and minds alike. But the breakthrough had a hidden cost. For every laugh, for every applause, for every role that made him a legend, the weight inside him grew heavier. Because Jim Carrey's genius was inseparable from his pain. Success had arrived, brilliant, dazzling, and intoxicating. But it didn't erase the shadows that had followed him from his earliest days. The world cheered. Jim Carrey wondered if they could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. And those cracks in time would grow into fractures that even fame could not heal. By the late 1990s, Jim Carrey had claimed the crown of comedy. He wasn't just an actor anymore, he was a phenomenon. Every performance was an event, every film a cultural moment. The Mask, Ace Ventura, Dumb and Dumber. His name alone guaranteed box office gold. Jim Carrey was Hollywood royalty, and the world bowed to his brilliance. Fans idolized him. Critics debated him. Executives feared missing him. He had become a symbol, the living embodiment of unrestrained creativity. But a crown is heavier than it appears. Behind the laughter and the public adoration, Jim carried responsibilities few could understand. He wasn't just performing for himself anymore. He was performing for millions who expected perfection, energy, and joy at all times. The demands of fame became relentless. Contracts, interviews, promotional tours. The king was always in the spotlight, never allowed to rest, never allowed to falter. And yet, Jim thrived. For a while, he seemed untouchable. He took on dramatic roles too, breaking the mold of comedy. The Truman Show revealed his depth. Man on the Moon showcased his ability to inhabit complexity, tragedy, and vulnerability. Suddenly, audiences saw not just the wild rubber-faced clown, but a man capable of profound artistry. He was lauded, celebrated, awarded. The crown suited him, yet it did not fit comfortably. Because the higher he rose, the more isolated he felt. Even in rooms filled with laughter, Jim sensed a growing distance. He could hear the applause, see the cheers, feel the energy, and still feel utterly alone. The crown had elevated him, yes, but it had also separated him from the world. Private struggles began to intensify. Years of hiding pain behind humor, of masking vulnerability with energy, started to exact a toll. He was constantly performing, even off-screen, and the cost was mounting. The media, ever hungry, painted him as eccentric, unpredictable, a genius, sometimes brilliant, sometimes bizarre. But the reality behind the public persona was complex, fraught with doubts, fear, and existential questions. Despite the crown, Jim began to wonder, was this the life he truly wanted? Was being at the top worth the constant pressure, the scrutiny, the isolation? He had everything the world claimed people should desire: money, fame, adoration. Yet he still felt a gnawing emptiness that no spotlight could fill. In private, Jim began to explore spirituality, philosophy, and introspection. He read voraciously, meditated, and sought meaning beyond the accolades and applause. The crown, once a symbol of triumph, was now a reminder of the walls that separated him from himself. And as the world celebrated his genius, Jim Carrey began quietly questioning it. Because being king of the world didn't mean he had conquered the kingdom inside him. The crown was dazzling. It shone for everyone to see. But for Jim, it also cast long, unforgiving shadows. Shadows that would soon reshape the path of his life entirely. For Jim Carrey, the price of fame was more than sleepless nights, endless travel, or public scrutiny. It was the quiet erosion of the self. The slow, almost invisible toll that comes when the world expects you to be larger than life, every single day. Behind the wild performances and box office success, Jim carried a private burden few could imagine. The laughter that filled theaters masked exhaustion, anxiety, and moments of profound loneliness. The man who could contort his face in ways that made millions scream with joy was often trapped inside a mind that struggled to feel peace. Relationships suffered. Friendships frayed. Romantic connections faltered under the weight of a life that never stopped moving. To love Jim Carrey was to love the idea of Jim Carrey, a force, a whirlwind, a living legend, but rarely the man inside. The public adored him, but in private, he wrestled with something far more dangerous, a sense of disconnection from himself. He questioned everything, his purpose, his worth, even the value of the laughter he created. The applause was intoxicating, but fleeting. The thrill of success came, then vanished, leaving him staring at the empty spaces where fulfillment should have been. He experimented with different ways to cope: art, meditation, spiritual exploration. Yet the pressures of fame never fully receded. Every film, every interview, every public appearance reminded him of a life that no longer felt entirely his own. The price also manifested physically. Years of overwork, extreme dedication to performance, and emotional strain began to wear him down. Moments of panic, exhaustion, and anxiety became increasingly common. Even the most exuberant public performances required careful preparation and emotional armor. Then there was the media. The endless speculation, misinterpretation, and sensationalism left scars invisible to the world. Every quirk labeled eccentric. Every withdrawal labeled strange. Every philosophical musing mocked or misunderstood. It wasn't just the public's eyes. It was their judgment, constantly weighing, measuring, defining who Jim Carrey should be. And he realized something terrifying. The more he gave the world, the more he lost himself. Each laugh, each exaggerated face, each line delivered to perfection was borrowed energy. Energy he would eventually need to reclaim. The price of the crown was clarity. It forced him to confront who he really was, beyond the masks, beyond the applause, beyond the persona. It demanded that he face truths he had long avoided, about happiness, about identity, and about what it truly meant to live a life free from expectation. By his early 60s, Jim Carrey had paid in full. The crown had brought him fame, wealth, and adoration, but it had also extracted a hidden, almost invisible debt, the cost of the self. And as he stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood, staring down the years he had spent performing for everyone but himself, Jim realized that some prices are too high, even for a king. Even legends are not immune to collapse. For Jim Carrey, the fall wasn't sudden. It was subtle, creeping in through the cracks that fame had long hidden. It started with quiet withdrawals, missing interviews, delayed film projects. Fans shrugged, the media speculated, but those closest to him recognized something deeper. Jim was retreating from a world that no longer fit him. The energy that had once defined him, explosive, unstoppable, magnetic, began to wane. He still performed, but each laugh, each gesture carried the weight of exhaustion, of introspection, of disillusionment. The man who had conquered comedy and drama alike now wrestled with the simple question, who was he without it? Critics noticed a shift in his work. Roles became sporadic. Movies were fewer. The laughter that once followed his every move was quieter, measured, restrained. The king of comedy, the face of Hollywood, was no longer visible in the spotlight. Personal struggles intensified. Relationships frayed further. The search for meaning became urgent. Jim experimented with spiritual practices, art, and philosophy, seeking answers the fame he had fought so hard to achieve could not provide. The higher he had climbed, the more isolated he felt. Even adoration could not fill the emptiness growing inside him. The world saw eccentricity. The world saw withdrawal. The world didn't see the human behind it, the man who had given decades of himself, only to realize that giving too much comes with a cost. Some moments were frighteningly dark. Depression and anxiety whispered in the spaces between performances. He questioned his relevance, his purpose, even the value of the very laughter he had spent a lifetime creating. In a way, Jim Carrey had built a world so dazzling, so overwhelming, that it left no room for the quiet humanity inside him. And when the walls of that world began to close in, retreat was inevitable. The fall wasn't public scandal or a failed project. It wasn't dramatic tabloid fodder. It was invisible, internal, seismic in its quiet intensity. A slow, painful unraveling of identity beneath the mask the world adored. And as he receded from Hollywood's stage, the man who had made the world laugh found himself staring into a mirror that reflected only questions. Who am I without the applause? Who am I without the mask? And what do I do with a life that has given me everything? Except peace? The world was stunned by his absence. Jim Carrey was gone, not dead, not disgraced, just unreachable. Because sometimes even the brightest star must disappear to survive. When Jim Carrey disappeared from the public eye, the world noticed immediately. No red carpet appearances, no talk show interviews, no films released, just silence. But the silence wasn't emptiness. It was intentional. It was survival. It was the sound of a man finally listening to himself. For decades, Jim had performed for everyone but himself. The world demanded energy, humor, absurdity, and he delivered without pause. But in that relentless giving, he had lost touch with the quiet, fragile man beneath the mask. The silence became a sanctuary, a place where he could think, reflect, and exist without expectation. He spent hours painting, writing, meditating, and exploring ideas that had no commercial value. It was a slow, deliberate process of untangling a life woven with performance, fame, and obligation. Friends and close colleagues noticed a profound change. The man who once radiated constant motion now moved deliberately, measuredly. His laughter still existed, but it was quieter, softer, more genuine. It wasn't for the world anymore. It was for himself. The media speculated endlessly. Some suggested eccentricity, others depression. Fans worried. Critics whispered. But Jim remained detached from the noise. He was no longer living in the public eye. He was living in the only space that had ever truly belonged to him. During this time, Jim began to confront the shadows he had long avoided. Childhood trauma, years of anxiety, the existential emptiness behind a lifetime of performance. He wrote, he painted, he studied philosophy and spirituality, diving into ideas that might have seemed abstract or irrelevant to the world, but were vital to him. The silence was not loneliness. It was clarity. It was healing. It was the quiet rebellion of a man who refused to be defined by applause or expectation. And slowly, the silence became a statement. Jim Carrey was still alive. He was still creating. He was just no longer performing for anyone but himself. In this withdrawal, he discovered something the world had never given him: peace. Not fame, not fortune, not recognition, peace. Yet even in the stillness, questions remained. Would he ever return? Could he ever return? And if he did, what would the world see? The mask or the man beneath it? The silence was not an ending. It was a transformation, a necessary pause before the next chapter. After years of silence, Jim Carrey's world began to shift. The man who had vanished from the spotlight was not gone. He had been transforming. The quiet had allowed him to explore parts of himself that fame and performance had long suppressed. He had painted, he had written, he had studied philosophy, mindfulness, and the nature of human existence. Each day of solitude had been a brick in the foundation of his personal renaissance. The world, of course, was unaware of the depth of this transformation. For most, Jim Carrey had disappeared. Headlines speculated wildly. Tabloids whispered of eccentricity, breakdowns, or spiritual obsession. Some dismissed him as washed up. Others feared he had simply burned out. But the truth was far more profound. Jim had been reconstructing his life from the inside out, learning how to exist beyond applause, beyond expectation, beyond the masks that had defined him for decades. His first gestures back to the world were subtle. A public appearance here, a carefully chosen interview there. But the difference was palpable. Gone was the manic energy that had defined him in his prime. Gone was the desperate need to perform for validation. What remained was calm, measured, and deeply authentic. Audiences immediately noticed. It was the return of a man who had lived fully in private, now emerging into public consciousness on his own terms. Jim's return was not about reclaiming fame or financial power. He had all that and more. Instead, it was about connecting, not with Hollywood, not with critics, but with truth. The truth of his own experience, the truth of art, and the truth of human connection. He began to choose projects that resonated with his inner life, scripts that allowed vulnerability, complexity, and introspection. One of the earliest signs of this shift came with smaller, unconventional projects, independent films, documentaries, and artistic collaborations that carried a rawness Hollywood rarely permitted. Jim embraced the uncertainty, the imperfection, and the humanity in these works. His performances no longer relied solely on spectacle or extreme exaggeration. Instead, they reflected subtlety, nuance, and the depth of lived experience. Audiences who had grown up, laughing at his rubber-faced comedy, began to see a new side, the thoughtful, introspective artist who had been hidden behind decades of public expectation. This phase of his return was also intensely personal. Jim used his visibility to explore themes that had haunted him for years: mental health, societal pressure, the nature of happiness, and the search for meaning. He began giving interviews that were rare, unscripted, and deeply revealing. In them, he spoke candidly about his struggles with depression, his past reliance on performance as a shield, and the lessons he had learned in solitude. People were captivated. The same man who had once forced laughter out of millions now inspired reflection and empathy. Art became central to his journey. Painting in particular became both an outlet and a statement. His canvases were bold, raw, and expressive, reflections of both his inner turmoil and his eventual clarity. Some were whimsical, reminiscent of his comedic genius. Others were haunting, reflecting years of introspection and emotional confrontation. Exhibitions of his artwork drew attention from both the art world and longtime fans. Through paint, Jim Carrey communicated a truth. that words and performances could never fully capture. But perhaps the most striking aspect of his return was his engagement with digital platforms and social media, where once he had avoided these modern tools, Jim began using them thoughtfully. Rather than seeking virality or spectacle, he shared reflections, philosophical musings, and glimpses into his creative process. His presence online was calm, deliberate, and thought-provoking, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of his early career. Fans and observers alike were drawn to this side of him, finding a connection that went beyond celebrity culture. Yet the return was not without challenges. Hollywood, still accustomed to the manic, larger-than-life Jim Carrey, struggled to fully understand the man he had become. Studios questioned whether his introspective, deliberate approach could translate to mass entertainment. Critics debated whether the quiet, reflective performances held the same genius as the explosive, rubber-faced comedy of his youth. But Jim remained resolute. He understood that his life was no longer about meeting the world's expectations. It was about aligning with his own truth. In his personal life, Jim also rebuilt relationships that had been strained or neglected during the height of his fame. Friendships were renewed with care and intentionality. Mentorship became a priority. He offered guidance to younger performers navigating the treacherous waters of Hollywood, warning them about the cost of fame he had paid, and encouraging them to stay connected to themselves. These efforts were quiet, often private, yet they demonstrated a profound evolution in character. Perhaps the most symbolic aspect of Jim Carrey's return was the reintegration of joy into his life, a joy not imposed by the world or by performance, but cultivated through self-awareness and authenticity. He laughed again, yes, but differently. Not with the desperation of a man seeking approval, but with the fullness of someone who had confronted the depths of his own mind and emerged intact. Audiences could sense the difference. The laughter felt real, grounded, and profound. Jim also began to explore philanthropy in ways that reflected his values. Rather than high-profile endorsements or performative gestures, he focused on causes that resonated with his life experience: mental health awareness, artistic education, and support for underprivileged communities. These were not announcements designed for attention. They were deliberate actions rooted in empathy, reflection, and personal conviction. The return culminated in a moment that surprised even his closest allies. Jim took on a high-profile project, not for fame or financial reward, but because it aligned with the narrative he wanted to tell: a story of human complexity, resilience, and redemption. The performance was met with critical acclaim, marking a triumphant re-emergence not of a comic superstar, but of a multifaceted artist who had endured darkness and emerged with clarity. Through this period, Jim Carrey became more than an entertainer. He became a symbol of transformation, of the possibility of reclaiming one's life after decades of external pressure, public expectation, and personal struggle. He demonstrated that retreating from the world is not necessarily defeat. It can be preparation for a return that is deliberate, authentic, and powerful. The return was not instant, nor was it easy. It was gradual, intentional, and sometimes painful. But with each step, Jim reclaimed parts of himself he had lost: the artist, the thinker, the human being behind the comedy. Today, Jim Carrey's return stands as a testament to resilience, reflection, and the courage to prioritize personal truth over public expectation. He has emerged not as the rubber-faced icon the world once cheered blindly, but as a man who has lived fully, faced his shadows, and chosen to re-engage with the world on his own terms. His journey back is a narrative of hope, that even after silence, after withdrawal, after years of carrying invisible burdens, it is possible to reconnect, not just with the world, but with oneself. Jim Carrey's return is not about regaining a crown he once held. It is about reclaiming identity, meaning, and joy. It is about showing the world, and perhaps reminding himself, that even after the deepest fall, after years of struggle and solitude, a return is not only possible, it can be transformative. And for those who have followed his story, who have loved his laughter, and who have wondered about the man behind the public persona, the message is clear. Jim Carrey has returned, not as a performer for the world, but as a man fully present in his own life. The return is complete. Jim Carrey's legacy is impossible to capture in a single headline, a box office number, or a viral clip. It is not merely the rubber-faced grin that once dominated theaters, nor the manic energy that defined an entire era of comedy. His legacy is deeper, more complex, and profoundly human. A story of transformation, resilience, and the courage to confront oneself in the quiet spaces where no one is watching. From his earliest days in a struggling Canadian household to his rise as one of Hollywood's most iconic performers, Jim Carrey has always been a man defined by paradox. He is both a clown and a philosopher, a comedian and a thinker, a performer and a deeply reflective human being. The world laughed with him, marveled at his elasticity, and celebrated his outrageous performances. But beneath every joke, every exaggerated face, every scene that seemed larger than life, there existed a man navigating the complexities of identity, expectation, and personal truth. It is precisely this tension between the public persona and the private self that defines his enduring influence. Jim Carrey taught the world that comedy is not merely entertainment. It is a reflection of life's absurdities, pains, and contradictions. His performances forced audiences to confront both joy and discomfort simultaneously, to see themselves mirrored in the chaos and brilliance of his work. That rare ability to entertain while revealing truth is a hallmark of genius. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jim's legacy is the lesson he embodies about the cost of fame and the value of authenticity. He climbed to the heights of Hollywood, achieving a level of success few can imagine. Yet he did not allow those heights to define him. When the crown became a cage, when applause could no longer mask internal struggle, he stepped back. He chose silence, reflection, and transformation over continued performance for an unrelenting public. This act alone is revolutionary in a culture that often equates value with visibility. Jim's retreat and subsequent return illustrate a vital principle. Legacy is not built solely through recognition or wealth, but through integrity, self-awareness, and courage. By prioritizing personal truth over expectation, he has left a roadmap for anyone seeking meaning beyond the superficial markers of success. In choosing to step away and rebuild, Jim demonstrated that true greatness is measured not by the applause one receives, but by the depth of understanding one cultivates about oneself and one's place in the world. The artistic contributions of Jim Carrey extend beyond cinema. His forays into painting, writing, and philosophical exploration reveal a restless, inquisitive mind that refuses to be contained. These works are not mere side projects, they are extensions of his creative spirit, windows into his internal life, and invitations for the audience to explore themes of identity, impermanence, and human emotion. His paintings, often bold, chaotic, and deeply personal, challenge viewers to consider the relationship between creation and self-expression, success and authenticity. In interviews and public discourse, Jim has increasingly used his platform to engage with pressing human concerns. He speaks openly about mental health, spiritual exploration, and the pressures of fame, offering insight and empathy to those who struggle in silence. By discussing his own challenges with honesty and vulnerability, he dismantles the illusion that success shields one from pain. Instead, he highlights the universality of struggle and the necessity of self-reflection. In doing so, he elevates his influence beyond entertainment, transforming it into education, guidance, and inspiration. Jim Carrey's impact is also generational. For those who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, his films were more than stories. They were cultural touchstones. He shaped childhoods and adolescence, teaching through laughter the subtle lessons of resilience, creativity, and the power of expression. Yet as his career evolved, the lessons became more profound. They moved from external comedy to internal exploration, encouraging fans not only to laugh but also to reflect, question, and seek authenticity in their own lives. In Hollywood, a world often obsessed with permanence, image, and relentless visibility, Jim Carrey's story is a radical reminder that legacy is personal, evolving, and internal. He resisted the industry's pressures to continue performing on autopilot. He resisted being commodified purely as entertainment. Instead, he reclaimed authorship of his life and work, demonstrating that the truest art comes not from obedience to expectation, but from the courage to explore one's own truth. The legacy of Jim Carrey is not just the films, the characters, or the laughter he brought to millions. It is the example he sets, that brilliance does not require self-erasure, that laughter can coexist with vulnerability, and that the most powerful performances are rooted in authenticity rather than spectacle. His journey from child of poverty to Hollywood icon to reflective artist illustrates the possibility of transformation at every stage of life. Critically, his legacy also challenges the cultural narrative of success. In a world that often measures achievement by visibility, acclaim, and wealth, Jim Carrey demonstrates that stepping away from the spotlight can be a courageous act of reclamation. He shows that the ultimate measure of a life well lived is not the accumulation of accolades, but the alignment of one's actions with one's values and self-understanding. Jim Carrey's influence is ongoing. Even in his later years, he continues to engage with audiences in unexpected ways. Through social media, art, and selective public appearances, he shares insights that resonate across generations. His presence encourages reflection, empathy, and a deeper understanding of the human experience. He is a teacher, a philosopher, and an artist whose lessons are delivered not through moralizing, but through example. The duality of Jim Carrey, the performer who electrified stages and screens, and the thinker who retreats into silence and reflection, is central to understanding his enduring significance. This duality reveals a universal truth, that all human greatness is inseparable from struggle, introspection, and the courage to confront oneself. Jim's life is a testament to the fact that behind every public triumph lies a private journey, often unseen, often uncelebrated, but always essential. Today, his legacy is secure, not just in the films that define his era, but in the lives he has touched through art, philosophy, and authenticity. He has shown that the journey matters as much as the destination, that the internal world is as consequential as the external, and that survival in the glare of fame requires more than talent. It requires insight, courage, and self-respect. For future generations of performers, artists, and humans striving to understand themselves, Jim Carrey offers a blueprint. Embrace creativity without fear, confront darkness without denial, and never sacrifice authenticity for acclaim. His life reminds us that laughter is powerful, but so is reflection, that visibility is fleeting, but integrity endures, and that even after silence, withdrawal, or personal struggle, a meaningful return is always possible. Jim Carrey's legacy is not just in what the world remembers of him, but in what he has cultivated within himself. It is a living legacy, one that grows as audiences, students, and fans engage with his art, his insights, and his story. It is a reminder that greatness is not solely in the spotlight, but in the courage to face oneself, to evolve, and to emerge fully alive, even after decades of performance, fame, and expectation. In the end, Jim Carrey's story is a triumph of humanity over spectacle, of self over persona, of authenticity over expectation. It is a reminder that behind every iconic figure is a human being navigating the same existential questions, struggles, and desires as everyone else, and that confronting these truths with courage can transform not only a life, but the lives of everyone who witnesses it. Jim Carrey's laughter will echo forever, but his reflection, his vulnerability, and his wisdom will endure even longer. The crown, the fame, the spectacle, they were only part of the story. The true legacy of Jim Carrey is the life he reclaimed, the authenticity he embraced, and the courage he demonstrated for all who dare to follow their own path, even when it requires stepping away from the world. Jim Carrey's story reminds us that legacy is not what we leave behind for the world, but what we cultivate within ourselves. It is not defined by applause, but by truth. Not by the mask, but by the man behind it. And in that truth, Jim Carrey has left the most enduring mark of all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to Talksberry and comment. Remember, greatness isn't in the spotlight, but in the struggle behind it.